Hi, everybody. So obviously, I'm out today. Another meeting at the district office. There seems to be a zillion of these this year. And I wanted to start today with a couple of reminders. Reminder number one is just to make sure that you guys understand. And please check your calendars because this verifies what I'm about to say. The Chapter 26 notes are not due on Thursday of this week. They are due Friday of next week. So if you're worried about how you're going to turn around such a big chapter in such a short amount of time, please just remember they're due next Friday. So first, just wanted to make sure that was clear. The second thing I wanted to bring to your attention is that what is due on Thursday are the Unit 4 lecture notes minus the World War I Tufte lecture notes that we had to subdue. Please hang on to those Tufte World War I lecture notes, and you're going to need those for the Schoology prompt that we're going to begin Unit 5 with next week when you get your new calendar. The four lecture notes that you should have ready to turn in on Thursday are posted up on the class website in PDF form. And just as a reminder, that is Politics and Urban Change in the Late 19th Century, the Progressive Era, American Imperialism, and the Roaring 1920s. So those are the four that you're going to be turning into me when I see you again on Thursday. Thursday also, as you guys know, is the day when you will be scheduling for your senior year. So it's imperative that you bring all of your scheduling forms, honors and AP contracts signed, etc., zero period request forms on that day, because what will happen on Thursday is that basically after I take roll and give you guys kind of like your goals for the day, because I have two self-directed assignments that you're going to be doing, your counselors are going to be pulling you out kind of piecemeal throughout the period to go ahead and schedule you. So when you do get pulled out by your counselor, it's literally crucial that you have all of your paperwork with you. So please don't forget to bring that. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is what we'll do on Thursday. And we have two assignments. One is going to be the chapter 20 through 23 test corrections that I would like everyone to try and finish in class. Because as you've probably already checked, the grades have been updated. And because quizzes and tests are worth 30% of your grade this semester, and we've only had one quiz, it's thrown off the grading a little bit. So I want to make sure everybody has their test corrections in by the end of this week. Okay, so you just got back a large amount of returned work, including the Scantron for the chapter 20 through 23 quiz. Please do not forget to bring that on Thursday, because that is the first thing that I'm going to let you guys do is finish those test corrections and get those 10 extra points added to your quiz grade in class. The other piece is going to be a follow-up to what you're about to see in this lesson. Okay, so we're going to begin the lecture now. So I want to draw your attention to the two photographs on the screen. They are iconic in their own right. On the left-hand side, what you see is a bread line. This was very common in American cities and towns across the country during the Great Depression. Many people, because the jobless rate was so high, relied on the goodwill of others to get their basic needs fulfilled. We know at this point that the highest level of unemployment that our country went through during the Great Depression was 33%. And just to give you an idea of what that means 33%, or roughly 1/3 of the American working population, who is willing to work but cannot find employment. Now you can imagine what type of impact that has on the economy. To give you just kind of something to compare it to, our current unemployment rate is hovering kind of around 5%. We have never reached, thankfully, the levels of the Great Depression since the Great Depression. The bread lines would stretch for just huge distances. Just to give you an idea, imagine that if you were standing at AT&T Park in San Francisco where the Giants play, and you were standing right at the front of the park on 3rd and King where the Willie Mays statue is. And then if you were to extend the line from that statue all the way down the Embarcadero to Pier 39, that would give you an idea of how long some of these lines were. And the food that was given was very basic. whether it be coffee and donuts for breakfast, a small sandwich, and additional coffee or tea for lunch, and some soup with some bread for dinner. And we're talking about people waiting in line that have several college degrees, have professions, had businesses of their own, but those were totally ruined as a result of the Great Depression. On the right, you see another iconic photograph for a couple of reasons. Well, number one, there's President Franklin Roosevelt with his granddaughter. But mainly, what stands out about this particular photo, other than a candid moment between a grandfather and his granddaughter, is that you see FDR in a wheelchair. FDR was stricken with polio in his mid to late 30s and lost the use of most of his leg muscles. Now, this is only one of 3 photographs that shows the president in the wheelchair, and it's something that bears mentioning, that FDR was president not 1, not 2, not 3, but for 4 terms, and yet he was bound to a wheelchair while he was president. Now, we understand now in the media that a handicap of that nature probably could not be hidden because of the age of information that we live in. But as you're going to find out, the press corps took a very different stance towards Roosevelt. I want to start showing with you some pictures from the era. Everyone knows what this is. This is Mount Rushmore. I don't doubt that some of you have been to it. But what's interesting to note about Mount Rushmore, it started in 1927 and was completed in 1941, just before the United States was to be involved in World War II. But this is actually, this is what we know as the complete, or I should say the completed Mount Rushmore. However, this was the artist's original design. As you can see, the full torsos of the presidents are seen. Now, another public works project that created a number of jobs during the era, very much like Mount Rushmore, was the Hoover Dam. Was built literally at the beginning of the Great Depression, bears the name of the president that kind of unfairly is blamed for the Depression, but an engineering feat in its own right. Employed thousands of people. Unfortunately, about 150 people perished on the project. But it was able to provide cheap electricity to people all over the area. So 2 public works projects that are worth noting. This next image is kind of more of a symbol of kind of America's struggle to get back on its feet. And it's an image of 2 boxers, 2 great heavyweight champions in their own right. The man on the left is American Joe Louis, 2-time heavyweight champion, and the man on the right is Max Schmeling, 1-time world heavyweight champion. Now, when you see this image, you might think, okay, well, there are 2 boxers, they're fighting, no big deal. But it was a big deal because Max Schmeling was this man's fighter, and he was used as a propaganda piece by Nazi Germany in the 30s to forward Adolf Hitler's very psychotic idea that somehow the German people were the superior race. And so this fight that you see pictured here took place in Yankee Stadium, right in the middle of the baseball diamond, in front of 80,000 people. And it went 12 rounds, and it was not the type of boxing that we see today with like a Floyd Mayweather where he basically just ducks and dodges and maybe throws a punch here and there, and then suddenly he somehow wins. This was old school heavyweight fighting where you stood toe-to-toe in the ring and you punched as hard as you could, and the other guy punched as hard as he could, and then you saw who was standing when the dust settled. And this fight went 12 rounds, and it was in the 12th round that Max Schmeling knocked out Joe Louis and became heavyweight champ. Now you can imagine what type of a propaganda boom that was for the Nazis, showing the superiority of the German race over not only the American culture, but also just in general over the democracies in the West. The 1930s was not a good time to be a Western democracy like the United States. England, France, many other Western democracies, the victors of World War I, were also suffering through an economic depression, whereas Germany was booming in the 30s. So you have to understand the kind of impact that must have had at home because of how bad things were during the Great Depression, and how the American people just needed a win.
And so the rematch was held about a year later between the champion, Max Schmeling, and Joe Louis. And although much of the statistics that came out of the next fight are estimated, it is estimated that through the technology of the radio, that the Schmeling versus Louis rematch was the most highly listened to sporting event in history. And I'm talking about Super Bowls, World Cups, nothing can even come close to it. And the reason wasn't because necessarily of a boxing match. It was more because of what it symbolized. You had Max Schmeling, who was unfairly used as this propaganda symbol of the Nazi power of the time. And then you had Joe Louis, the American champion, who had gotten knocked down, but was ready to get back up on his feet. And in towns and cities across the United States, didn't matter what religion, what ethnicity you were, people listened to their radios on the night of the Louis fight. And they weren't disappointed because in the first round, Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmeling. Why am I bringing this up? Is it a symbolic kind of representation of what happens to the United States during the 1930s? Yeah, it is, to a certain extent. But just to give you an idea of how hopeless people were, that they had to put their hope in a boxing match. They needed a win. The Depression, as you're going to find out, was really tough for many, many people. Now, don't feel too bad about Max Schmeling because everything's going to end up okay for him. In fact, Joe Louis and Max Schmeling form a very close personal relationship after World War II. Max Schmeling becomes one of the leading corporate executives for Coca-Cola in Germany, and there he is after the war, and largely in part to Joe Louis's help. And what's odd about that is Joe Louis helped Max Schmeling out in the 1950s to get back on his feet. Whereas in the 1970s, when Joe Louis was kind of having some financial issues, Max Schmeling played a very important role in his life. So just kind of an interesting side story there. All right, so America's sick economy. I'd like you please to copy this down. If our substitute teacher could please pause the video now. Okay, so many historians point to the start of the Great Depression with the crash of the stock market, and that is true, but there are a couple of factors that we also need to consider. Number one, America was overproducing. An example of this would be the Ford Motor Company. At the beginning of the 1920s, Ford was churning out cars, and they were being sold just at an absolute feverish pace. And the problem was, though, is that your supply should meet your demand. But what was happening in many American companies, especially in the late 20s, is they kept producing at a high level, but the demand wasn't there. So in 1928, you could go to the Ford Motor plant, say in Detroit, and look out on their yards outside the factory, and you would just see a sea of cars that had less than 1 mile on them because they literally were driven off of the factory room floor and then parked, and they just sat there. And it wasn't just in consumer items that we were overproducing. We were overproducing raw materials. We were overproducing agricultural products. So what ends up happening is when you have too much of a supply and your demand doesn't quite meet it, you have to drop the price of that particular item. And the problem is that if people stopped producing, if people aren't producing, that means jobs aren't being created. So we just kept producing in the 1920s nonstop. Another reason for the Great Depression hitting so hard was that more and more Americans were spending beyond their means. This idea of using credit, which is very common now, was brand new in the 1920s, to where a person who was making a salary that would be considered working class could afford, through credit, some of the luxury items of the time that we all kind of, rely on now, whether it be cars, refrigerators, washers and dryers, dishwashers, etc. So you have an American public who is overproducing, not buying products, and on top of that, they don't have any spending power either because all the money that they're spending is credit, not actual hard cash. And then this is extended into the stock market where you have individuals buying on margin. And what that means is that you're buying with the profit that you may have earned from a particular company. So say, for example, if I were to buy 100 shares in 1925 of a particular company, and I bought those shares at $1 a piece, and then that particular company, let's say it was a radio company, it blew up, and suddenly now those shares are worth $100 each. Well, I've become very wealthy. Now, I should only have two options. Either I keep my money in the company and watch it grow, or I sell my shares to make my profit. But what people would do is they would take that money, in my case, the $99 on the dollar that I earned, and then I would use that money that's not necessarily real and buy other stocks with it, to where everybody was playing the stock market by the late 1929. And what happened is that since so much of the stock that people owned were bought on profits that were contingent upon companies doing well, when the stock market started to sell, it freaked people out, and there was a massive sell-off on October 29th, 1929, to the point where people walked into the stock exchange millionaires, and by the time they walked out, not only were they penniless, but they were in massive debt. This also created a run on America's banks. I mean, you go to the bank now, and you have your checking or your savings account, and you go up to the teller, and you say, "Hi, I'd like my $100, please." And they say, "Okay, here you go." Well, what happened in the 20s is people did the same thing after the stock market crashed, but many of the banks had invested their money in the stock market, and a lot of them did not have enough money, cash on hand, to cover all the deposits they had. So people basically were turned away from their banks that had their money in them, which then forced the American consumer to lose confidence not only in the stock market, but also in the banking system. And they started to hoard their money. My grandma and grandpa kept their savings for at least 4 or 5 years, at least until Roosevelt became president, under a floorboard in their apartment. And this was very common. So if people aren't putting money in banks, banks can't invest that money. They can't give out loans to create businesses. And if people aren't spending their money, you have this just tidal wave of a stagnant economy. And this massive snowball effect of all these events that created unemployment of 33% at its height. So we're in bad shape. Now, how does this affect the American populace? Well, we're going to look at that slide right now. We're going to talk about life in the Great Depression. If our substitute teacher could please pause the video now. Okay, so life in the Great Depression, as I'm sure you guys can imagine, was extremely tough. I think an example of this is seen in a family recipe that was handed down to my wife from her grandmother. Before she passed away, my wife's grandma would always make this kind of lime jello dessert for Thanksgiving. And when she did pass away, Adriana was asked by her mom to make her grandma's recipe. It was quite an honor. And of course, she pulled out the recipe, and it was written, in this really amazing handwriting. And as she started to look at it, she noticed that some of the ingredients were very strange. Now, I'm sure you guys have all had Jell-O of some type, in your life. But I didn't realize that this lime Jell-O dessert that her grandma made was actually made with quite a lot of mayonnaise. I'm talking like 5 ice cream scoops of mayonnaise in this dessert. Now, why that was the case, I'm not sure, but just to give you guys an idea, is that when people cooked in the Great Depression, they used whatever they had on hand. In many cases, they would substitute things using mayonnaise. And sure enough, I guess, my wife's grandma had access to a lot of mayonnaise during the Great Depression, because if you look at a lot of the other older recipes that come from that era, mayonnaise is used in all of them. So you have massive unemployment. You saw the soup kitchen and breadline picture at the beginning of the lecture. What you also have created are these shantytowns, or makeshift shacks, mainly in public parks, that became known as Hoovervilles. And we're going to talk about how Hoover was unfairly blamed for the Great Depression here in a second. And here's a picture of a Hooverville. As you can see, they look like nothing more than sheds. And these popped up in major American cities all over the country. This one happens to be in Cincinnati, Ohio. And many people who lived in these kind of makeshift Hoovervilles were out of necessity because they had lost their home, etc. But there were plenty of working individuals that basically sold their home and moved into these type of shacks to save money because they really had no idea where things were going. To give you an idea of how bad it was during the Great Depression, there's one year in the Great Depression, 1933. It's the only year in American history to date that there have been more people leaving the country than coming into it. And just to give you an idea of how bad that was, 250,000, 250,000 Americans left the United States. These are people born and raised in the U.S., in many cases third or fourth generation. They moved to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. When you move to a communist dictatorship, especially one as brutal as Stalin's regime, that tells you something about how bad things were in the U.S., where when you look at communist Russia and go, oh, okay, yeah, that's a good choice. Now, why is that the case? Well, yes, you have the joblessness, you have obviously bread lines, the Hoovervilles, but also there's the Dust Bowl. And I know that many of you in your English classes are talking or about, or maybe have read or about to read The Grapes of Wrath. And just to give you an idea, the Dust Bowl, when you have all these farms being foreclosed on, crops aren't growing. And when you couple that with a drought, you have a lot of loose soil. And with a lot of the high winds that take place in the middle part of the country, you create these massive dust storms. Now, you might think, well, big deal, so what? It's some dirt in the wind. But imagine if you were to walk out your front door and you were to see this coming straight at you. That's when you turn around and go, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. So Americans felt that not only was their economy and their way of life turning on them, but also Mother Nature was turning on them. Which is why you saw a massive amount of Americans leave and move other places. So the next question is, okay, so we're in this national catastrophe. What is being done to solve it? Well, the approach that President Hoover takes is one that is ultimately going to lead to his downfall. And we're going to talk about that right now. So please, if our substitute teacher could pause the video now. Okay, so Hoover becomes president in 1928, a year before the Great Depression hits. Wrong place, wrong time. He was a very intelligent man, and contrary to popular belief, he did do a number of things in his role as president to try and fight the Great Depression. However, Hoover, like both presidents from either party, Democrat or Republican, before him, believed in this idea of rugged individualism, that Americans were unique because any problem that was thrown their way, they could pretty much, pick themselves up by their own bootstraps, dust themselves off, and get back to work. And so when many people called to the federal government to take a more active role in helping to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression, Hoover's response was this rugged American individualism. He said, listen, it's not the federal government's job to basically get the American people out of this. The federal government's job was to encourage solutions, not control them. And it was really on the American people to help themselves. Now, you can imagine how this messaging must have been received at the time. I mean, it would literally be like if I were standing in class right now giving a lecture, and suddenly the air conditioning vent fell on me. And so there's this massive piece of metal that's on me, and I'm obviously in a lot of pain, probably broken a couple bones. And you guys are sitting there, and it would be like this. It'd be like, well, Mr. Gibson, you did use the air conditioning a lot this year, so you need to lay there and kind of think about, what you've done. And that's how it felt from many Americans' perspective, to where they said, listen, President Hoover, Congress, etc., we need help. And when the response is, well, you need to figure it out for yourself, you can imagine how it made people feel about their government. And Hoover made a drastic mistake when it came to a group of individuals that became known as the Bonus Army. There were over 5 million American soldiers and sailors that served in the American Army and Navy and Marine Corps during World War I. Many of them maimed and wounded in the trenches of Europe. And Upon return, and rightfully so, Congress promised these veterans a bonus that they would receive in 1940 that would help them when they retired, just as a kind of a thank you for their service. Well, in 1932, many of these veterans were out of work and they needed cash now. And so they lobbied Congress and basically said, hey, listen, we'd like our bonus early, even though it's not going to be the full amount because we need the money now to help our families through this Great Depression. And the answer from Congress and the president was, no, that's not the deal. We're not going to give you your cash. And so as a result, 20,000 veterans of World War I marched on Washington and camped on the Washington Mall, right there in front of the Capitol building. Now, at this point, you would think these are veterans that served in World War I. They would be treated with reverence and respect by their government for their service. But Hoover made a drastic mistake. He instead set the current American army on the bonus army to kick them out of the Washington Mall, using fire hoses, using clubs, in some cases using weapons. We know at least one veteran soldier was killed as he was trampled by the crowds as they were being rushed out of these makeshift camps. And that pretty much sealed the deal for Hoover, because not only did he seem, and not only that, but his Congress, did they seem unsympathetic to the American people's plight during the Great Depression, but also, I mean, when you forcibly remove veterans with current soldiers, you're politically dead. And that is seen in how Hoover was trounced in 1932 by Franklin Roosevelt. This is one of the biggest landslides in American electoral history. Obviously, no one comes close to Washington when you get unanimously selected. That's pretty good. But what this is, more than anything, it's a commentary on the role of government in the United States at the time. The way that we see things now is that when there's a national disaster or somehow a national tragedy, we expect our federal government to act and do something. That expectation did not exist until Franklin Roosevelt became president. So you want to get this slide down, and if our substitute teacher could please pause the video now. Okay, so FDR is president. Well, he runs on a platform with the slogan, "Happy days are here again." And he promises, if elected, that he is going to make sure the federal government takes a much more active role in helping to alleviate the problems of the Great Depression. And when he makes his first inaugural address, he says to the American people, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." And as you're going to find out, this is just an introduction to what is known as the New Deal. The steps that Roosevelt is going to take are large and very controversial at the time. And I want to just make sure that you guys understand that although FDR is considered a top 5 president, like all the other presidents, he is not without his faults. We're going to talk about how he tried to pack the Supreme Court, how he tried to price fix using his executive power, as well as his influence in Congress. His civil rights record is okay. It certainly didn't match his beliefs. FDR was a huge civil rights advocate, but he could have done more in his office as president to kind of forward more civil rights, not only for women, but for people of color. FDR also had a very large family with his wife, Eleanor, who in her own right was a great American. We're going to be talking about her as we continue on through the 1930s and 40s and beyond. But he wasn't exactly the most faithful. He had 2 separate extramarital affairs with his secretaries. So not a perfect guy by any means. But it's remarkable that, a person of this intelligence and kind of will was elected president because of his handicap. Now, you and I believe that, and I certainly believe this very strongly, that people that have a handicap, I don't view them as weak, I view them as very strong. just as I'm sure many of you do, because they have to overcome their handicap just to live a daily, normal life. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there that use the stereotypical image that when they see someone in a wheelchair, they don't think they're powerful, they think they're weak. And what's amazing about Roosevelt's rise is that, number one, he was able to conceal his handicap in a number of ways, and number two, that the American press corps didn't report anything about it. I mean, can you imagine if, say, President Obama had a prosthetic leg and reporters from Fox News, MSNBC, and the New York Times found out about it? Don't you think that everyone would know that, well, President Obama has a prosthetic leg? Yeah, they would probably report on that. But the entire American press corps, we're talking about major American newspapers and radio stations all over the country, many of them knew that FDR was in a wheelchair, and yet no one put it out in the media. It says something about the time, but it also says something about the message of FDR to the American people. One of the ways that he hid his handicap from the public is, you see pictured in front of you. He would drive his car all over the place when he was campaigning, when he was president, because what they did is they had fitted the car to be run completely with his hands. You know, near the steering wheel, you had the gas, you had the brake, you had the clutch, etc. And when I come back, I'll talk to you. Please remind me when I see you on Thursday to show you guys one of the other ways that FDR would conceal his handicap. Now, what we're going to start with is something called a fireside chat. And it was a brilliant move by Roosevelt that has been mimicked by presidents ever since. And that is using the media to get your message out. And what was astonishing about his fireside chats is that no American president had sought to use the media to get their message out to the American people. But Roosevelt knew that everyone had a radio. Whether you were rich or poor, you could afford a radio. And that was the most popular entertainment, probably next to motion pictures, of the 1930s. It was a great escape for people to kind of get out of the doldrums of the Great Depression, to be able to sit down for a half hour, an hour with their family, gathered around the radio, listening to one of their favorite shows. And Roosevelt was brilliant because he used these as a way of reaching out to the American people. Now, the method and the reason why they're called fireside chats is because of how informal they were. You know, normally, even today, presidents usually begin addresses to the American people by saying, "My fellow Americans," and then they usually end by saying, "God bless you and God bless the United States of America." That's fine. That's just what presidential bookend speeches are now to the public. But FDR didn't have formal speeches with the American public in these fireside chats. Instead, he would begin his address by simply saying, "My friends." And Americans listening to FDR as he was talking to them, they felt that they were being talked to individually as if he was sitting right there in the chair next to them by the fire, just talking about the problems of the nation. And as you're going to find out when we listen to a fireside chat, FDR did not talk down to the American people. He did not try and simplify things so they could understand it. Instead, he said, "Here's what we're going to do, and here's how you can help." And that empowered a lot of Americans. Okay? Now, he uses these fireside chats to get his message out, but also as a way of advertising what are called alphabet agencies. Now, we're going to talk about these on Thursdays. These are federally funded programs from his New Deal, which were created to combat the Great Depression, specifically unemployment. So what we're going to do now is we are going to listen to a fireside chat from FDR, the first fireside chat he gave on March 12, 1933. So I'm going to give you guys time to please go ahead and take out your the handout that is titled FDR Fireside Chat, March 12, 1933. If our substitute teacher could pause the video at this point to give people time to get those out. You're going to need a pen, a pencil, and a highlighter for this because you are going to be making some annotations as we listen to the fireside chat. Okay, everybody, so what I'd like you to do right now is please make sure that you have out the handout that is titled FDR Fireside Chat, March 12th, 1933. This handout we are going to be using momentarily, and you guys are actually going to be hearing the President's first fireside chat to the nation as President a couple weeks after he was inaugurated. FDR is going to talk about in this speech the banking crisis, one of the major problems
that caused and then exacerbated the Great Depression. And so, what I'd like you to do is, as you are following along with the president as he reads his speech to the nation, is I'd like you to highlight as you read any words or phrases that you think would give a person who was living amidst the Great Depression either hope or reassurance. Hopefully, the lecture gave you some context in terms of how difficult it was for many Americans during the Depression. So, again, as you listen, just please highlight any words or phrases that you think would give a person living in that time period hope or reassurance. And so, without further ado, here is Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat on March 12th, 1933.
We are speaking to you at this time from the Oval Room of the White House in Washington, D.C. Through the facilities of its combined networks from coast to coast, the National Broadcasting Company is about to bring you an address by the Chief Executive of the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking, to talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is wholly sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was, of course, impossible to sell perfectly sound assets of a bank and convert them into cash except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday, and this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their functions to take care of the distribution of food and household necessities and the payment of payrolls. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. Remember that no sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors last week. Neither is any bank which may turn out not to be in a position for immediate opening. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. The new currency is being sent out by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in large volume to every part of the country. It is sound currency because it is backed by actual good assets. Another question that you will ask is this: why are all the banks not to be reopened at the same time? The answer is simple, and I know you will understand it. Your government does not intend that the history of the past few years shall be repeated. We do not want and will not have another epidemic of bank failures. As a result, we start tomorrow, Monday, with the opening of banks in the 12 Federal Reserve bank cities. Those banks which on first examination by the Treasury have already been found to be all right. That will be followed on Tuesday by the resumption of all other functions by banks already found to be sound in cities where there are recognized clearinghouses. That means about 250 cities of the United States. In other words, we're moving as fast as the mechanics of the situation will allow us. On Wednesday and succeeding days, banks in smaller places all through the country will resume business, subject, of course, to the government's physical ability to complete its survey. It is necessary that the reopening of banks be extended over a period in order to permit the banks to make applications for the necessary loans, to obtain currency needed to meet their requirements, and to enable the government to make common sense checkups. Please let me make it clear to you that if your bank does not open the first day, you are by no means justified in believing that it will not open. A bank that opens on one of the subsequent days is in exactly the same status as the bank that opens tomorrow. I know that many people are worrying about state banks that are not members of the Federal Reserve System. There is no occasion for that worry. These banks can and will receive assistance from member banks and from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And, of course, they are under the immediate control of the state banking authorities. These state banks are following the same course as the national banks, except that they get their licenses to resume business from the state authorities. And these authorities have been asked by the Secretary of the Treasury to permit their good banks to open up on the same schedule as the national banks. And so I am confident that the state banking departments will be as careful as the national government in the policy relating to the opening of banks and will follow the same broad theories. It is possible that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear to you that the banks will take care of all needs, except, of course, the hysterical demands of hoarders, and it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime in every part of our nation. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. People will again be glad to have their money where it will be safely taken care of and where they can use it conveniently at any time. I can assure you, my friends, that it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than it is to keep it under the mattress. The success of our whole national program depends, of course, on the cooperation of the public, on its intelligent support, and its use of a reliable system. Remember that the essential accomplishment of the new legislation is that it makes it possible for banks more readily to convert their assets into cash than was the case before. More liberal provision has been made for banks to borrow on these assets at the reserve banks, and more liberal provision has also been made for issuing currency on the security of these good assets. This currency is not fiat currency. It is issued only on adequate security, and every good bank has an abundance of such security. One more point before I close. There will be, of course, some banks unable to reopen without being reorganized. The new law allows the government to assist in making these reorganizations quickly and effectively, and even allows the government to subscribe to at least a part of any new capital that may be required. I hope you can see, my friends, from this essential recital of what your government is doing, that there is nothing complex, nothing radical in the process. We have had a bad banking situation. Some of our bankers had shown themselves either incompetent or dishonest in their handling of the people's funds. They had used the money entrusted to them in speculations and unwise loans. This was, of course, not true in the vast majority of our banks, but it was true in enough of them to shock the people of the United States for a time into a sense of insecurity and to put them into a frame of mind where they did not differentiate, but seemed to assume that the acts of a comparative few had tainted them all. And so it became the government's job to straighten out this situation and to do it as quickly as possible, and that job is being performed. I do not promise you that every bank will be reopened or that individual losses will not be suffered, but there will be no losses that possibly could be avoided, and there would have been more and greater losses had we continued to drift. I can even promise you salvation for some, at least, of the sorely pressed banks. We shall be engaged not merely in reopening sound banks, but in the creation of more sound banks through reorganization. It has been wonderful to me to catch the note of confidence from all over the country. I can never be sufficiently grateful to the people for the loyal support that they have given me in their acceptance of the judgment that has dictated our course, even though all our processes may not have seemed clear to them. After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States has spoken to you from the White House in Washington, D.C. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
Okay, so now you've heard President Roosevelt give his first fireside chat. And what I'd like to just quickly review with you before you go, if there's still time in the period, are the three most frequent words that show up in that fireside chat other than the word bank. And they are listed here: will, you, and our. Now, when you look at this slide, it probably looks a little strange, but the words that you see here are powerful because of what they imply. The word will implies that action will be taken of some kind, or when phrased with a question, it's asking someone to participate in something, which is clearly what FDR is trying to do in this case. We see him use the personal tact of his fireside chats in always speaking to the American public as an individual rather than a giant group. As I mentioned before in the lecture, people, when they listened to FDR's fireside chats in the midst of the Great Depression, felt like the president was talking directly to them. So you is a word that we can obviously see FDR is going to use heavily in not only this first fireside chat, but obviously every other fireside chat he gives over the length of his presidency. And lastly, the word our is probably the most important. Remember, Herbert Hoover tried to convince the American people that the Great Depression was something that the American people needed to solve themselves, that it wasn't the job of the federal government to solve that problem. Instead, it was the job of the American people. That's that rugged individualism that most Americans, responded to and agreed with. But FDR is saying something different, and this is where we see a fundamental change in what the expectations that we have about the federal government. When he says our, he's saying, yes, the American people play a very vital role in fixing the issues that caused the Great Depression. But in the same sense, he's also saying that the federal government will be an equal participant, especially at the end of this fireside chat where he says, it is no more your problem than it is my problem. And that is what was so engaging and so powerful about FDR's fireside chats, is that the American people felt that with him at the helm, their federal government was alongside them in the struggle to get out of the Great Depression. All right, so that ends the lesson for today. I'd like to just remind you to please bring your scheduling forms on Thursday. In addition, please also do not forget to bring your Scantrons that you just got today that were passed out, because as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be doing test corrections while you guys are scheduling on Thursday. All right, thanks a lot, you guys, and we will see you. I'll be back at school tomorrow on Wednesday, so if anything comes up or you need to come see me, please go ahead and do so. Have a great day, and may the force be with you all.